Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's good to see a good group of colleagues, students, friends from St. Stephen's Comedy Bank Church, and I think there will be a few more people coming from, the Brazilian community of Edinburgh and my own family as well. But yeah, there are some difficulties involved in bringing 3 kids into new college, but they will arrive shortly. So also thank you very much for Emma for organizing this book launch, and to Timo, Maya, and Alison for joining us for the book launch. So as we usually start in academic books, I would like to begin by thanking some key people who helped bring this book into being. The monograph started as a doctoral dissertation at the Faculty of History of the University of Cambridge, and my biggest intellectual debt is to my former supervisor, Professor David Maxwell. So David welcomed me into Cambridge with immature research ideas and broken English, and was remarkably patient, encouraging, and supportive as a supervisor. So after the PhD, I went back to Brazil, my home country, and joined the Brazilian Center of Analysis and Planning in São Paulo as a postdoctoral fellow. And I thank Professors Angela Alonso, Maria Hermínia Tavares, and Vera Chatan for making this possible. So the Cambridge Trust, the Brazilian Federal Agency for Research, CAPES, and the São Paulo Research Foundation funded generously my research. So my 3 kids who have just entered, Maria Clara and Francisco, were all born. Yeah, they were all born as I carried out this project, and paradoxical as it may sound, there would be no book without them. At some point in 2020, when I began to turn my thesis into a book, and we were all stuck at home for over a year under the nightmare of the coronavirus pandemic and Bolsonaro's government, I thought that they were actively militating against this project, right? But then I soon realized that they were actually trying to make me see what really matters in life. The book is, of course, dedicated to my wife, Priscilla, not only because she was the first person to hear my tentative and uninteresting arguments and archival discoveries, or because she encouraged me to pursue this project when I thought I had reached dead ends, but simply because she's my best company in life, and because we both endured a lot together over the years. So Propagandists of the book is a study of evangelical print culture in Brazil in the period extending roughly from 1860 to 1930. More specifically, it examines the intricacies of the early history of Brazilian Protestantism through an analysis of the production and circulation of evangelical texts. The book looks at an array of Christian periodicals, tracts, pamphlets, books, and Bibles, and contextualizes their ideas, retraces their trajectories, reconstructs the aspirations and motivations of the agents who circulated these texts, and explores the reading practices that emerged in their wake. The idea to write this book came about when I visited this church. I visited the archive of the Presbyterian Cathedral of São Paulo in December 2015. The archive held the so-called collection of evangelical tracts organized and compiled by the historian and Presbyterian minister, Reverend Vicente Temudo Lessa. This collection comprised over 600 short books and tracts published in multiple locations, mostly in Brazil, Portugal, and the United States, and in various languages, though the majority of them were in Portuguese. Between the late 1850s up until Lessa's death in 1939. The collection was significant because it preserved both high-level texts, such as theological treatises and religious controversies, and also popular low-level texts, such as pamphlets and short tracts, that captured the voices of ordinary believers who left little traces in other historical records, but played a vital role in the making of this new religious universe. These texts pointed to a lively yet neglected history of public intellectual exchange and debate in the Brazilian public sphere. Catechisms, doctrinal pamphlets, conversion narratives, and religious controversies attacked the foundations of the Catholic Church, and especially the modern renewal of Catholic worship and politics, while simultaneously translating central practices, ideas, and beliefs of evangelical religion to their Brazilian audiences. This initial venture pushed me to collect more evidence in other libraries and collections in Rio de Janeiro, Brasília, and the countryside of São Paulo, and enabled me to delve into the intellectual climate of the age. And this is one of the volumes of the collection of evangelical tracts. However, other questions persisted beyond the purely intellectual questions that I was interested in. Texts are by no means purely receptacles and transmitters of religious wisdom and ideologies. They are also things, and I was discussing that with my students just now. They are paper, ink, and covers, right? There remained the challenge of identifying who read these texts, in what conditions, and how they were circulated. Additional research into ecclesiastical and missionary archives in Brazil, the United States, England, and Scotland provided crucial information about the ways in which these texts were disseminated, and uncovered how different social categories made use of print matter in modern Brazil when around 80% of the population was illiterate. Converts read aloud to their congregations letters, hymns, and sermons printed in evangelical periodicals, while the educated children of evangelical families recited biblical passages, catechisms, and devotional tracts to kin and neighbors in domestic meetings. These sources illuminated the reading practices that emerged from below in Brazilian society. The book has an overarching narrative that starts with the arrival of the first of the first communities of Protestant immigrants and missionaries in the mid-19th century, and closes with the study of the rise of an evangelical intelligentsia in the first 3 decades of the 20th. This is the table of contents. Chapter 1 traces the first wave of Protestant expansion in Brazil between 1860 to 1900, and situates this experience into the social and political transformations of the age, which were quite remarkable, such as the abolition of slavery, the overthrow of the Brazilian monarchy, the proclamation of the Republic, religious, very tense religious conflicts in the Brazilian Northeast, and so on. So the chapter looks at the rise of an institutional machinery created by Protestant missions and churches, and locates the rise of the evangelical publishing enterprise in this process. The second chapter is a case study of the operations of 2 London-based evangelical publishers in Brazil between 1870 to 1900, the British and Foreign Bible Society and the Religious Tract Society. It reconstructs the experiences and ordeals of the itinerant booksellers called reporters, right? Like this guy who put an impressive number of Christian books and Bibles in circulation in the country. The following chapter examines how Brazilian evangelical converts took part in social, political, and religious debates in the context of a conflict involving ultramontane Catholic clergymen and the Brazilian monarchy in the 1870s. In the wake of the conflict, Brazilian Protestant writers felt at ease to attack both the global renewal of Catholic worship and hierarchy and its local reverberations in Brazil. Chapter 4 is concerned with conversion, through an examination of conversion narratives, spiritual autobiographies, and biographies of early converts. The chapter concentrates on the interactions, objects, practices, and ideas that brought about religious change, and also unpacks the responses of 2 different generations of converts to the new religion. Chapter 5 examines how Latin American ministers appropriated and modified the idea of Christian cooperation. It traces how this idea traveled from the World Missionary Conference just, in the opposite side of this building, of Edinburgh in 1910, to a series of evangelical congresses in New York, Panama City, the East Coast of South America, and finally Rio de Janeiro. The last chapter in the book reconstructs the life, worlds, and thought of a Brazilian Protestant intellectual elite. Straddling religious and secular domains, the protagonists of this chapter served as church pastors, mission theorists, and literary scholars who took part in the literary academies and the emerging universities of the country. So the chapter examines closely how they engaged with Anglophone Protestant theology to participate in the social, literary, and cultural debates of the country. So this is Propagandists of the book in a nutshell, right? And I look forward to hearing the comments from the panelists. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Emma, for having me at this event. Thank you, Pedro, for writing this very engaging book that it's been my pleasure to engage with over the weekend. I think maybe the first thing I want to say about the book is, and I'm saying this as somebody whose area of study is quite distant from the area of study that Pedro engages with here. I'm not a historian of religion. I know, and to the extent that I've read about religion in Latin America, it would have been about Catholicism, which is one of the reasons that this book is so welcome, I think. And I know much more about Mexico than I know about Brazil. And as somebody, coming to this book from afar, so to speak, I really appreciated the clarity and the precision with which Pedro writes, with which he lays out his argument, with which he also lays out the historiography on his topic on Protestantism in Brazil that he engages with. So in other words, it's very easy to engage with this book, not previously knowing much, let's say, about Protestantism in Brazil. It's a very good introduction to this topic, and that is maybe one of the reasons that all of you should feel encouraged to take advantage of the discount that I saw advertised on the screen a while ago. And also as somebody who's sort of like read this book while having a bit of a brain fog from a cold, I was again, I'm very grateful about the ease with which it's possible to sort of like enter into the subject matter. This is a really nice introduction as well as a specialized study of Protestantism evangelism in late 19th and early 20th century Brazil. I'm a social historian, and so I want to focus on the parts of the book that have spoken to me most as a social historian. The book, and you will have gathered that from Pedro's introduction, you can read both as a social but also as an intellectual history. So there is a lot about what actual evangelical intellectuals, if you like, sort of consciously contributed to intellectual public discourse in Brazil during the last decades of the empire and the first decades of the old republic. Actually, all of the decades of the old republic. It more or less ends in 1930. But there is also a lot about what Protestantism meant to what Pedro just called ordinary believers and how ordinary believers contributed to the spread of Protestantism in Brazil. And so the first thing really that I want to sort of like highlight in the book is a marvelous section in, I think, the second chapter about Protestant itinerant Bible sellers, or colporteurs, they were also called. So this was a sort of species of itinerant bookseller employed by evangelical publishers who on foot or by mule traveled the sort of vast hinterland of Brazil, trying to sell Bibles that had been translated into the Portuguese vernacular, and that were trying to create a kind of public, a kind of market for the Bible. And these people, went through a lot of difficulties that are simply associated in this period with traveling in Brazil. There's, there are very sort of like difficult modes of transport. There's no good infrastructure. There are vast distances. There's also at times encounters with epidemic diseases and things like that. But I just wanted to read a very, very brief section. I'm going to read a couple of more brief sections in a while from the book, just to give you sort of like a little bit of a taste of what the book sounds like. about one of the difficulties that these booksellers encountered. The reaction of public authorities against the circulation of evangelical scriptures in Brazil, and here it's important to be reminded maybe that Brazil is, of course, at this point an overwhelmingly Catholic country. So the reaction of public authorities against the circulation of evangelical scriptures in Brazil was a source of anxiety for colporteurs. Although Protestant missionaries and foreign visitors in 19th century Brazil acclaimed the liberality of the empire's constitution and the qualities of Emperor Dom Pedro II, colporteurs faced different realities in their journeys to small towns and through the Brazilian countryside. Whereas foreign Protestant travelers represented the monarchy as an enlightened institution that enforced order and the empire of the law upon its provinces, colporteurs dealt with the peculiarities of local politics. João dos Santos wrote to the Society in 1882 that to prevent county magistrates from prohibiting the selling of Bibles, each colporteur had been furnished with a, quote, printed copy of the law on the subject and of the resolution passed by the Brazilian government in 1868, which authorizes the circulation of the scriptures as a branch of industry or commerce, end of quote. So this was the first little detail, if you like, or one of the details that really caught my attention, was this necessity of furnishing Bible sellers, like with the printed laws that actually said they were allowed to sell these Bibles in a staunchly Catholic countryside, where authorities were otherwise of the mind that maybe it was not allowed, or that one maybe should prohibit, or that one maybe in some cases charge a special tax for the selling of Protestant Bibles. The other way in which this is really a book that is very interesting to a social historian is that Pedro is interested in the concrete meanings that Protestantism acquired in the social worlds of Brazilian converts. There's a wonderful chapter, chapter 4, that is all about the conversion experience of again, Pedro's ordinary believers in, I think, especially Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo in the countryside. These are people who convert to Protestantism in part because they feel that it allows them, or that it gives them, a sort of like everyday sense of the divine. Pedro writes that intersects, or that can inform their concrete life practices and life experiences. So here again, I want to just read a small passage from the book. So converts longed to approach God through the medium of the written word. They were animated by a desire to enter into a relationship with the Trinity through prayer, worship, and the devoted study of the Bible. They also held an everyday sense of the divine. This is captured in a story written by Maria Chavez, who's the educated daughter of an illiterate early convert to Protestantism in the Minas Gerais countryside. On a certain occasion, she writes, her father employed a fair share of his savings in a crop of rice, which was followed by a severe drought that threatened to ruin his business. Her anguished and pious mother went to the field and uttered an ardent prayer. In Maria's narrative, the skies darkened immediately and a copious rain spared the crop. In a revealing sentence, Maria claimed that, quote, this rain covered such a small area that it seemed to have been sent only for us, end of quote. Their religion was neither the disenchanted Protestantism, Pedro writes, of learned elites, nor the world of signs and wonders of the Pentecostals. By that time, missionaries, local ministers, and converts viewed expressions of religious enthusiasm and mysticism with suspicion, but they nevertheless believed that divine providence and aid manifested in their daily lives. And then the second way that I want to highlight in which Protestantism really manifested, if you like, in the daily lives of converts is that it gave them a way to think about self-improvement, and that it acted in a way as a mechanism for, or as a spur towards self-discipline, personal reformation. So in that sense, it was instrumental in the formation of kind of like modern, more individualistic subjectivities in Brazil. And here I've got just a brief final passage that I want to read from the book. In some manifestations, the evangelical reformation of Mores was expressed through a set of behavioral prohibitions and counsels. Converts were instructed to refrain from alcohol, tobacco, and gambling, to keep an orderly organization of their houses, to dress modestly, to be zealously dedicated to their work, and to keep the Sabbath, usually the Sunday. These sets of behavioral instructions can be seen clearly in the rules of conduct written by the founder of the Evangelical Congregation of Perdizes, Minas Gerais, Manuel de Melo. Manuel was an archetypical Caipira convert, a man of unsophisticated manners and ungrammatical language, whose, quote, zeal towards the sacred things, end of quote, bespoke of his religious sincerity amidst his rusticity. Manuel's rules of conduct contained a set of general prohibitions against lying, idleness, and fanaticism, including some specific warnings against bearing arms or sleeping during religious services. One of the rules read, quote, the believer must have his house well cleaned, even if it is a hut. He himself must walk around clean, even though his clothes may be very humble, because Jesus loves poverty but condemns laziness. So this is more or less the extent of my comments that I had prepared, and I just want to end by maybe asking one question to Pedro that you can address after all the comments have been made. And this is, to what extent do you see in the spread of Protestantism among ordinary believers, especially in the South and the sort of like South Eastern states in Brazil, a similar, I don't know, engagement with modernity, with the political context at work, that in other parts of Brazil, and most famously in the Northeast, at the same time informs these very large and at the time they're read as very fanatical, sort of like popular Catholic movements, such as in the sort of like Catholic sort of lay community that forms in Canudos around a very sort of famous and charismatic lay preacher. So thank you very much again for this opportunity to speak here, and I very much recommend this book to all of you.
So I'd like to start by thanking Emma for inviting me, and Pedro as well. It's wonderful. It's always a pleasure to come to New College. And it's a real honor to be here, to be invited to engage with the writing of such an impressive scholar as Pedro is. Propagandists of the book is a rigorous and wide-ranging piece of work that really immerses us in the early history of Brazilian Protestantism. It shows us the complex and ambiguous responses of Brazilians to the circulation of texts and new ideas. And it doesn't just talk about Protestantism. What's great about it is it really talks about everything that's going on around it, about Catholicism, about the politics, about the economics. In that sense, it's wide-ranging. It's really telling us, beyond what's going on with these early converts, about the general social and political transformations happening in Brazil and indeed in South America more generally, you know, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in that sense, it's a real work of history and really worth going to, even if Christianity or Protestantism isn't your thing, but perhaps the history, that particular period of history in South America is. It's a work of very careful scholarship. It's measured. And I think this comes through in some of the comments that have been made about it. It's a very rewarding read, and I think Timo's just pointed to that. It has a very confident tone and it's very beautifully written. I want to comment some more on some of the observational and descriptive gems buried in the pages of this book. But as an anthropologist, I hope you'll forgive me if I bring us back to the present for a moment, away from the early 20th century and back into the present, in order to potentially, hopefully there'll be time to return there. Because I do think it's an interesting present for us in religious terms and for Brazil in particular, as it is in other places. I'm an anthropologist of religion and of Christianity in Brazil. And in particular, I cannot help but notice that public and academic discourse about Brazil as a country, a culture, a nation, is absolutely dominated by talk of Protestant evangelicalism. Evangelicalism, as it's known in Brazil, the evangelicals, has for a long time been rising across the continent. We know that. And the numbers and statistics around this are very impressive. In 2022, there were approximately 22 million evangelicals. So that's 22% of the total in Brazil, compared to 125 million followers of Catholicism. So at that time, around 64%. These figures followed an average of 0.8% growth among evangelicals since 2010, whilst Catholics showed a drop of 1.2% over that same period. Now, according to studies by the IBGE, which is Brazil's National School of Statistical Sciences, evangelicals are expected to surpass Catholics in Brazil for the first time around the year 2032. That's when the absolute numbers of followers of each of the two religions should be at around 90 million. That's the projected figure. Now, this year, the numbers of Catholics in Brazil had been expected to drop to a percentage for the first time below the 50% mark. But on checking the figures this morning, I discovered that as of September the 11th this year, Catholics in Brazil were holding on to that halfway mark, but only just, with 51% of all adherents. Now, I must confess, I'm not a fan of statistics. Having a low IQ, I try to avoid them in general. But it is interesting. I find them interesting as a social phenomenon. For me, they're interesting in how they stoke debate, this public debate, this academic discourse about Brazil's religious landscape, or if we'd like, its religious weighting, right? Where the religions are, who they are, what percentage they have of the nation. Now, some of this obsession, this concern with weighting, has to do with the fact that evangelicals are not just growing numerically, they're growing in their diverse forms and dominations in terms of cultural dominance. Academic journals and secular liberal media in Brazil are today filled with articles about the worrying synergies and business deals between evangelical megachurches, social conservatism, and right-wing Bolsonaroism, and even fascism. Now, whereas the Catholic Church helped to shape Brazil's colonial infrastructure, its connections with the elites of Europe and its early modern institutions, evangelicals, labeled by the media as many times as extremist, are perceived in a grotesque parody of Christian ecumenism to be taking up too much space in those institutions, filling seats in Congress for one thing, and for another, certainly in economic terms, surpassing the Catholic Church as shapers of Brazil's commercial and economic future, its very neoliberal future. In Brazil today, one of the wealthiest evangelical pastors, and a very famous one at that, is Silas Malafaia. He's a prominent figure in the neo-Pentecostal movement. Some of you may have heard of him, and his financial success can be attributed to several factors, including his extensive media presence, the establishment of a large church network, and various business ventures. But Malafaia's wealth is also reflective of the broader trend within Brazilian evangelicalism, where pastors leverage their religious authority to build substantial financial empires. We see the same economic ambition across various evangelical leaders, very prominent in Brazil today, who've capitalized on the growing evangelical demographic. But it's not just these political and economic trends that I think have the Brazilian secular liberal media so worried. It's the way Protestantism's rootedness in Brazil has started challenging much loved representations of Brazilian culture and Brazilianness. And I'm thinking here of the stories that Brazilians often tell to themselves and to outsiders about who they are, what they are like, and where they come from. It's a story about modernity, to be sure. Brazilians have always been modern, but it's not necessarily a story about work ethic and sincerity, as scholars like Weber and more recently Webb Keane have elaborated on for Protestant Europe. For a time, evangelicalism wasn't really a threat to this romance story that Brazilians tell and like to tell to outsiders, for Protestants didn't have a large enough share of the public sphere to make themselves matter. Moreover, they could be easily dismissed, as they could be easily classified as inside outsiders. For example, in 1960s Brazil, you wouldn't have expected to see a Baptist swaying softly, tanned and lovely along the streets of Ipanema, or a Presbyterian downing cachaça in a bar, or an Anglican in a samba parade at the Rio Carnival. That's not to say that they didn't participate in these sort of iconic cultural activities. It's to say that you wouldn't have expected to see them at those. Protestant Brazilians simply didn't partake in Brazil's celebration of its own cultural heritage, nor did they attempt to lay claim to some kinds of prominent Brazilian discourse about its supposed racial democracy. The average Brazilian's powerful spiritual connection to the Black Atlantic or to their indigenous ancestry and culture. A Brazilian anthropologist I know once proudly explained to me that Brazilian culture was inherently analogical, like minute hands on the face of a clock, capable of traversing opposite poles and every point in between. Brazilians can go backwards, forwards, and around, he explained proudly. They can prevaricate exquisitely, revel in ambiguity. You Protestant Europeans aren't like this, he added. He was looking at me. You live with a binary imagination. European thinking is a project of exactitude, of certainty. It's black or white and very boring. Now, I'm not sure how exact or precise, if exactitude is a virtue in this context, my Brazilian friend was being, but I know what he was getting at, and I think what it shows us is just what is at stake with Pedro's fabulous book. Because today, with the rise of evangelical culture, Brazilian culture itself is changing. Evangelicals are taking back the public sphere, claiming the same heritage, even if claiming it means having to purify it and rid it of some of its demonic attributes. So clean living evangelicals are dancing in samba parades. Black evangelical women are selling African street snacks on the streets of Bahia, dressed up for the tourists as candomblé priestesses. Evangelicals are even doing what Brazilian Catholics have long specialized in, becoming non-practicing and lapsed. But perhaps most importantly, evangelical culture is becoming Brazilian in its own right, even though it always already was. It's becoming Brazilian in its own right through the scale of its share of Brazilian media, through music, magazines, internet, television. So evangelical publics are no longer counter publics or small publics. They have basically become mainstream. So if we want to understand Brazil, we need to understand the Protestant identity. And Pedro's book comes at a very prescient moment for this, for it gives us this important understanding of the birth of all of this. His rendering of this early period is very refreshing in its complexity and subtlety. There are no cartoons in this book. There's no pastiche. And this is really refreshing in a kind of sphere of debate and discourse where, you know, particularly in the secular liberal media, there is a lot of pastiche and sort of cartoon being drawn around what the evangelical persona is. And this book's a really sort of refreshing breath of fresh air in all of this. It's showing us that careful reflection, self-critique is part of who these early converts really were. There was a sort of real self-consciousness about them, a real reflexivity about them. And there's so much more I could say about this book, you know, that its details and arguments that I could go into at length, but I know that time's running out. So I want to end with simply an observation, perhaps an overall observation. If I could sum up the book and what it means to me or what I connected with. I think partly also because Timo spoke at length about my favorite chapter, which was also chapter 4 on conversion, which had so many fantastic characters in it, including Donna Maria, who's a rural woman whose house is filled with chickens and images of saints and rosaries and candles. And after she converts, the chickens are banished to the outside, which was just sort of so, you know, iconic, but also a little bit sad, you know. Felt sorry for the chickens. And now I'm working on Catholic environmentalism in the Amazon. So I'm thinking a lot about kind of, you know, religion and the non-human. And I'm sort of, you know, it really struck me, that example. But no, what I want to say is one of the lovely things about this book is how one of the things that strikes about some of these early converts, and particularly in chapter 4, is this just sort of simple curiosity, and that they have this kind of simple burning curiosity to know more, to study texts, to study, I think. And so we're not talking about a kind of road to Damascus kind of conversion. This is not a rupturous thing. And we're not talking about indoctrination. We are genuinely talking about a lot of people. And I know people like this from my own field site, illiterate people, people who've never read a book, who just want to sit down with you and talk for hours and hours about the story of Noah's Ark or some aspect of Christianity, some story in the Bible, because they never really went to school and they don't have many outlets. And I'm not talking about a kind of buried intelligentsia. This is not an intelligentsia. This is, if you like, a very authentic, just human curiosity and faith, if you like, that's emerging in a very kind of touching way in a context where people wouldn't have had many other outlets or opportunities to explore that side of themselves. And I think this is some converts and these early Protestant converts in the south of Brazil and many of the kind of rural Catholics that I worked with in the early 2000s in Northeast Brazil. And I was very touched by that connection in the things that I recognized in the quality of their faith and that curiosity and that desire to sort of have that intellectual stimulation. So anyway, thank you, Pedro, for a fantastic book. I strongly recommend you all read it and buy it.
That work? Okay, yeah, great. Thank you. So yeah, I want to start by thanking Emma and the Center for having me, and the speakers who came before me for giving their time to have such a fruitful and interdisciplinary discussion, which I think really reflects the interdisciplinary nature of the book. I also want to thank Pedro especially for writing such a nuanced and interesting book and giving me the opportunity to speak on it, and as well for helping guiding my own work as my supervisor here at Edinburgh. Any ingenuity in what follows is really a reflection of his work, and we can say that any mediocrity might be a reflection of my own. As a world Christianity student, I'm going to highlight some of the book's contributions to the field specifically, and add on to the anthropological and historical perspectives that we've heard today so far. So without further ado, in Propagandists of the book, Pedro demonstrates how the evangelical publishing enterprises irrevocably linked Brazilian Protestantism to the printed word, and also constructed an evangelical text culture throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. For those of us committed to the field of world Christianity, and especially the history of world Christianity, this project delves into key themes of our studies, such as mediating the global and the local, exploring the messy heritage of mission, and uncovering racial intersections. But most interesting to me was Feitoza's approach to the question of religious encounters. Much of world Christianity scholarship is concerned with how to characterize encounters between Christian evangelists and their non-Christian interlocutors. We often ask how evangelists convey their message, how interlocutors innovate this message, and how power is distributed in these interactions. Of the most notable treatment of encounters in the field, Jean and John Komaroff characterized the interactions between the European missionaries and the Tswana as a, quote, long conversation with overt and covert meanings. In contrast, J.D.Y. Peel characterized the interactions between Yoruba Protestant missionaries and non-Christian Yoruba as an encounter grounded in indigenous agency. And David Maxwell more recently characterized the interactions between British Pentecostal missionaries and the Luba as an entanglement of open-ended and unpredictable interactions. To these approaches, Pedro's discussion of Protestantism in Brazil adds a unique case study. Oftentimes, world Christianity scholars explore those encounters between peoples of different faiths, different languages, and different races and cultures. But Pedro's case study explores how Brazilian Protestants evangelize to a largely Brazilian Catholic audience. He thus focuses on encounters between people who share the same language, who are often raised in the same culture and religion, and therefore most often already share the same fundamental Christian beliefs. As we see throughout Pedro's work, their common tongue and common culture give way to a flourishing print tradition, even among the semi-literate public. Pedro thus contributes to the field by exploring religious encounters through the lens of these print publications. His archival work shows that the printed publication, as both text object and text messenger, helped mediate the wide range of textual encounters between Protestants and their multiple audiences. Among the semi-literate Brazilian rural communities, for example, individual literate persons would read the text aloud to their community and engage in informal oral discussions. Such practices showcase how Protestant texts cultivated local literacy traditions, mixing print and oral traditions. Indeed, across the wider country, Brazilian Protestant and Catholic encounters, albeit antagonistic encounters, were mediated through their own publishing and press campaigns. And in the wider transnational publishing world, Anglo-American Protestant publishing societies printed a range of textual objects, like Bibles and books and pamphlets, to facilitate their encounters with their Brazilian audiences. Moreover, Pedro shows how this text world is porous and enables the two interlocutors to shape one another. Just as much as publishing societies circulate literature to shape the beliefs of their audiences, so too do specific audiences shape the literature. In one example, in response to Catholic suspicions of Protestant Bibles, Pedro shows how publishers began to publish smaller portions of tracts to make them less suspicious to Catholics. And this resulted in the highest sales they had yet. Indeed, the back and forth print conversation between Portuguese-speaking Protestants and Catholics is a long encounter that shapes each interlocutor. This long encounter is key to the third chapter of Pedro's work. Just as Protestants published textual criticisms of Catholics, so too did Catholics publish criticisms of Protestants. And to defend themselves and condemn their Catholic opponents, Protestant writers utilized a range of doctrinal, sociopolitical, and academic ideas. In so doing, these long print encounters inevitably solidified the Brazilian Protestant identity and designated them as a people centered on their books. Like the other speakers, one of the things that most excited me in this work was also Pedro's discussion in chapter 4 of the role of print in conversion. He argues that print not only facilitated the encounters between Christians and the potential convert, but that print also facilitated the encounter between the convert and God, in what Feitoza calls a, quote, process of persuasion. This is most evidenced by his example of an autobiographical conversion narrative from 1885. In this tract, a Catholic woman named Osonia details a casual domestic gathering among friends. There, the friend, referred to here as Mr. M, persuades her to read the Figueiredo translation of the Bible. As Osonia spends a week reflexively reading these Protestant materials, she painfully begins to reconsider her own Roman Catholicism. And upon reading the Pentateuch's condemnation of image worship, Osonia is then inspired to burn her own images of saints. This violent act of rupture with Catholicism thus marks her conversion. Pedro's analysis of this narrative is most insightful. He highlights a significant function text play. Conversion was a process of persuasion via her individual and unmediated experience of the written word of God. This experience stands in contrast to her Catholic spiritual experiences, which were not individualized and were mediated through the very saint images she then burned. Osonia's reflexive reading of the Bible enacts the renewal of the apostolic meditation of the early church that Protestants at the time were hoping to recover. So if we return to the world Christianity terminology of encounters, in this example, Osonia is converted through her distinctly Protestant encounter with the text. Moreover, Osonia's conversion is not an isolated incident. Rather, I think her encounter encapsulates the overarching print world at play in Pedro's work, and which entangles the local and the global. Osonia would not have had this opportunity if not for Mr. M's persuasive informal conversations as one Brazilian speaking to another. Moreover, the very Bible that Mr. M gives Osonia is the Figueiredo version. This, as Pedro describes in the book, is the Portuguese language translation, written by the indigenous priest Antonio Pereira de Figueiredo in 1790. This book was later printed and circulated across the Lusophone world by the British and Foreign Bible Society. I've tried to highlight today how Pedro's analysis pushes us to not only consider how the printed text shaped encounters, but also pushes us to turn to consider the convert's encounter with the physical text of the written word. Beyond the question of encounter, Pedro's work uncovers rich examples of print culture that provide much material for consideration across the field, such as for navigating the global and local, legacies of mission history, questions of race, and understanding competing religious authorities. I'm sure that not only will this work have valuable insights for scholars in the field now, as it has for me, but also that the book will be a source of inspiration for scholars to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I'm just going to ask Pedro to respond for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for your questions in the room and online. Thank you, Pedro.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Timo, Maya, and Alison for the wonderful comments, and also for providing some food for thought and for highlighting some, interesting passages of the book that, resonated with your own research interests and that caught your attention. So it's wonderful to know that at least 3 people read the book, after such a long process of writing it. So yeah, it's worthwhile. And it's good to hear the comments as well, mostly rewarding comments for me. With regards to Timo's question about how did these early converts engage with modernity, especially in comparison with the Canudo settlement in the Brazilian Northeast in the 1890s. I think they were obviously engaging with modernity in different ways, denial, but also through appropriation of the technologies of modernity, right? Especially writing. And I think that these spiritual autobiographies and biographies of early converts that I mentioned in chapter 4 of my book, right, focusing on conversion narratives, they really point to something interesting, right? How writing about the self produces a separation between the self as an object and the self as a subject, right? How writing about the conversion of experiences of these early converts really enables these converts to situate their own lives and experiences into like a broader providential history, right? In which they experience the action of God, but also in which they themselves are agents of historical transformation. So I think writing and reading provided a space for these early generations of converts to engage with especially the tools and values of the modern world. But I don't like to situate these early evangelical converts and the folk Catholics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries into opposite poles, right? They were both experiencing the same processes of social and political transformation in Brazilian society. They were both trying to revive an old faith, right, by engaging with the teachings of the Vatican, by engaging with the lay Catholic associations, right, especially the so-called houses of charities and the collective mobilizations that popular Catholic preachers organized to restore run-down church property. So these Catholic movements were modern in themselves as well, right? They were engaging and promoting modernity through different ways, right? By encouraging faithful Catholics to imagine themselves as members of a transnational community of, actively committed Christians, but also taking part in mass mobilizations by organizing, prayer meetings and public preachings in public squares, like the founder of the Canudo settlement did in the Brazilian Northeast. So I think they were engaging with modernity in multiple ways, and I think to situate them in polar opposites, as some of the literature does, is not quite productive. Maya mentioned the burning curiosity of the first generations of converts, or their eagerness to engage with the printed word, to learn things, right? To have access to print, to written material, right? To print, print culture, and that I think it's a really interesting point, and really suggests different modes of religious renewal and conversion. So recently, my friend Manuela Carpinedo, another ethnographer like you, wrote a wonderful book on this, on what she calls the Judaizing evangelicals in Brazil, right? Which focuses on a group of evangelical converts, mostly from Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal churches, and also, you know, charismatic Baptists and so on, who are turning to Jewish practices and rituals, including some really demanding rituals and practices for themselves. They do not live like in close-knit Jewish communities, right, where kosher food is available easily, and they have markets and, you know, shops where can they can, you know, sustain their own choices. They go through, you know, great lengths. They encounter innumerable difficulties to live their own religious choices in their own contexts. And one of the things that Carpinedo says that these you know, Judaizing evangelicals are interested in is study, right? They really want to know more, and they want to become learning subjects, right? People who are highly invested in an intellectual exercise, in a reflective exercise. So things that practices that they do not encounter in the, you know, in much of the contemporary charismatic churches in Brazil, right? So yeah, I think there's a driver of religious change here that really, you know, illuminates different, you know, religious practices and transitions, both historical and contemporary. And thank you, Alison, also for situating my book within, you know, this lineage of very distinguished scholars, such as the Komaroffs, John Peel, and David Maxwell, who was my doctoral supervisor, by the way. So yeah, I was when I was doing my PhD, I was surrounded by distinguished Africanists in Cambridge, right, including Professor Emma Wildwood, and another group of, you know, people studying missions in Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. Also, the rise of the Pentecostal movement, the rise of charismatic Christian movements in sub-Saharan and West Africa. And one of the things I learned a lot was to be comparative, right? When people ask me what world Christianity is, I really don't know what to say, how to respond, right? But I think one of the benefits we get in our craft is that we read comparatively a lot, and we learn a lot by reading things written by, you know, scholars working in different parts of the world. They really illuminate our work. And yeah, I was trying to show how a close examination of the evangelical print culture of the 19th and 20th centuries in Brazil reveals the intricacies and the complexities of the religious encounter in Brazil in the 19th and 20th centuries, right? This requires what John Peel calls hermeneutics of deep suspicion, right? Have to read the sources suspiciously, trying to get behind, you know, behind the back of the persons who are narrating these religious transformations, and filter their own motivations and their worldviews and how they, you know, inflect in the sources that they write. You have to read between the lines to capture hidden meanings or significant details that appear in the sources, right? So I think this exercise really helped me to be reflexive and, you know, to interrogate my sources with a lot more confidence and awareness, I think. So I think this is what I had to say. I don't know what to do now.
Pedro, thank you very, very much.